Well, if you think your city, town or village could make an interesting television programme, Open Space would like to hear from you. Write to Open Space, BBC TV, London W12 8QT. Well, next week in Open Space, a group of mentally handicapped dancers bring you their own special performance of the Butterfly Ball. Starting on BBC One in about 10 minutes, Max Boyce goes west to become a clown at the Cheyenne Rodeo. This is BBC Two. At 7:30 p.m. on the 5th of July 1954, from Alexandra Palace, Richard Baker introduced Britain's first television news bulletin. Tonight he recalls that evening and traces the history of BBC TV News the first 30 years.
Here is an illustrated summary of the news. It'll be followed by the latest...
It began yesterday when the French Union and Viet Minh representatives agreed on
reported a short while ago that pieces of wreckage had been
sighted. So far, we know there are 23 survivors after Manchester United's
in Ghana seems to have been foiled within 4 hours.
German Chancellor Herr Brandt is in London tonight for another...
Yard have just issued an appeal for information about a
Democratic
car
Party headquarters in the Watergate building had been burgled and bugged.
Stop intimidation of minors who want to work and their families. That's all for now. I'll be back with the late news summary at about 11:45. Until then, good night.
So, another television news bulletin comes to an end. Every day for the past 30 years, there's been that same feeling of relief that, for a while at least, the programme's over. But only for a while, a matter of hours at most, until Sue Lawley or one of the other news presenters is back in front of the camera again, and the same process begins once more. And that's the key to news. It's continuity. Television's longest-running show, once it actually got there. Because getting it there was described at the time by one of the most senior television figures as the sorriest mess he'd ever experienced in television. And the reason, by an extraordinary stroke of irony, was the very success BBC radio news had built up during the Second World War.
Hello, BBC, this is Frank Gillard here, recording just outside Scilly, a mile or two back from Scilly, on Friday morning, June the 16th, during a barrage which is being laid down to prepare the way for an infantry attack on a...
The reports by Frank Gillard in France, Richard Dimbleby over Berlin, and dispatches by other members of the BBC's war reporting unit gave BBC Radio News a reputation for professionalism and integrity unrivaled by any other broadcasting organisation.
The bombers of the main force are now streaming in above and below us. As we drive steadily over Cologne in a dead level straight line, the German flak is winking and flashing.
These films, by the way, of the correspondents in action, were made for the cinema audiences of the day. But even without the pictures, the reports and the radio bulletins that went with them were dramatic enough.
The BBC Home and Forces programme. This is Bruce Belfridge.
By the end of the war, 10, 12 million people at a time were tuning in their radios at 9 o'clock, almost as a matter of course. The national appetite for news was now firmly established.
In full retreat.
And then in 1946, once again, there was television. And from the start, there was no doubt in the minds of the men and women who gathered at Alexandra Palace to get the network off the ground that some sort of visual news would be an integral part of the service. But it wasn't to be, not for another 8 years.
Here at Broadcasting House in Portland Place, the men who made the major decisions saw themselves very much as the guardians of that reputation for news which the BBC had built up during the war. And that reputation, they decided, should in no way be put at risk by allowing such a newfangled toy as television to take control of something as important as news. And besides, the Director General of the day, Sir William Haley, thought the BBC had more urgent things to spend its money on. Though he didn't object to the development of a newsreel, the kind of thing which had been immensely popular in the cinemas in the 1930s and 1940s. So plans for that went ahead. It was regarded simply as entertainment and therefore no threat to the standing of news.
The television newsreel began in 1948, pretty much on the lines of the cinema newsreel, and the programme was an instant success with the viewers.
In Paris, they're now displaying the autumn fashions. Jack in the Box is apparently out of date, and Jill in the Box appears to show us the latest designs in women's hats.
So long as it stuck to entertainment, the programme, which was totally under the control of the television service,
was safe from the attentions of the BBC's editorial chiefs at Broadcasting House. But within a couple of years, the people running the newsreel started to put in more and more topical material, often very topical. Stories that came perilously close to news coverage.
On Monday morning, television made history by transmitting pictures for the first time from within the precincts of number 10 Downing Street. The occasion was the first of the current meetings of the Dominion Prime Ministers.
It was the start of several years of often bitter argument between the television service and the guardians of the BBC's news reputation at BH, as the headquarters of Sound Radio is called. Basically, the problem was that the pictures of current events were supplied and controlled by the television service. The editorial responsibility for the coverage was claimed by radio's news division at Broadcasting House.
Went exactly to its custom.
The deadlock continued until in 1953, two developments forced everyone to rethink their positions. The televising of the Queen's coronation was a triumph. The day-long coverage was hailed as superb, and Richard Dimbleby's commentary as a masterpiece.
The Queen returns toward her chair of estate. There will follow the first part of the taking of the coronation oath, an oath which binds Her Majesty to the service of her peoples and to the maintenance of the laws of God.
The proceedings were watched by millions, some round at their neighbours, some on borrowed sets, and it finally convinced a lot of people that television was worth having. Sales of sets rocketed. But more than that, here was proof of an appetite to see what was happening in the world as well as to hear about it. But at just about the same time as the successful coverage of the coronation, there was another, even more compelling pressure on the BBC to find a way of resolving its internal difficulties. A rival commercial television network was soon to be launched, and on it, plans for a fully fledged television news service. The BBC's Written Archive Centre at Caversham in Berkshire. Here, all our past is neatly stacked away in some 200,000 files, right back to the birth of the BBC itself. And here, the reaction of the corporation to the success of the coronation broadcast and the prospect of a rival independent television news is very evident from the documents. The Director General became so annoyed with the snags that seemed to crop up every time television news was discussed that he wrote a memo to senior members of his staff. I cannot help feeling there's not been enough determination displayed by those who have to work on this problem. Whatever their feelings in the matter may be, their job is to do everything in their power to assist. Quite simply, television service felt that their newsreel program would provide the right basis for the new service. The news division people at Broadcasting House, on the other hand, felt that in matters of news, the BBC must speak with one voice, and that one voice must be theirs.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news.
The overwhelming argument that people from news division at Broadcasting House used to justify their stand was quite simply that they had the experience, the facilities, and above all the reputation to do the job properly. Nobody here at Radio News headquarters denied that the television people knew about pictures and presentation, so that area was allowed to come from the television service. But everything else, editorial control, story content, headlines, even the opening words of each script had to come from BH. Against that unhappy background, at Alexandra Palace on July the 5th, 1954 at 7:30, the first programme went on the air. As it happened, my voice was the first to be heard.
Here is an illustrated summary of the news. It'll be followed by the latest film of events and happenings at home and abroad.
The truce talks in Indochina went on today. They had begun yesterday when the French Union and Viet Minh representatives agreed on the subjects to be discussed. It is in a neutral zone here at Trung Gia that the talks...
The first and obvious problem was the invisible newsreader. John Snagg's mellifluous tones were no substitute for the ability to have someone in the studio who could give out facts that simply couldn't be illustrated. But visible newsreaders were forbidden because they might imply comment through a particular look or expression. The effect was an endless succession of captions and maps. Still pictures were on the screen interminably and explicitly described.
King Gustav and Queen Louise of Sweden left London by air this afternoon for home after a week's stay in this country. This picture from London Airport shows the Duke of Edinburgh shaking hands with King Gustav, who is with the Queen on the right of the picture. On the extreme left is the King's granddaughter, Princess Margareta.
All the film in the programme was in the second part, the newsreel section. It had some of the characteristics of some of the original television newsreel, but lacked the polish and refinement.
Dismantling the whole wartime system of food distribution. Despite increased home produce, meat supplies have been the Ministry of Food's biggest problem. Quantities still come from Australia and New Zealand, South America and elsewhere. From the quayside, the frozen meat is taken to big storage depots, such as this one at Smithfield. From here, it leaves on its way to the shops. And lastly, the housewife's view, as given to our reporter, Godfrey Talbot.
Now we have a representative of all those who, at the weekend, go into the butcher's shop and actually buy the meat. The housewives and all those who do the shopping for the family. We've got one of them here, Miss Warren from Herne Hill, who does shop for a family every week. What difference is this decontrolling going to mean in your shopping life?
Well, the main feature of de-rationing is the advantage of going into any shop I want to go into, being able to buy meat just as I want it, and if I happen to be entertaining at a moment's notice, such an advantage to dash into a shop and buy an extra steak or chop.
What did those involved with the programme feel about it?
Absolutely ghastly. For these reasons, the structure of the thing, the bit that Dickie Baker read out earlier, about an illustrated summary of the news, followed by film of events and happenings at home and abroad, is an absolutely crazy way of putting a television news bulletin together, because it means you haven't got the film where you want it for the lead stories, and it's relegated to the second part. Well, words fail me. I mean, it's just a disaster.
Sir Anthony Eden has been appointed Prime Minister.
Within weeks, in an effort to meet some of the criticism and to inject more life into the programme, BH made a concession. Readers would be allowed to appear in vision, but not people chosen for their skill in appearing in front of the cameras. The faces were to be those of the various radio correspondents. The very first to appear was E.R. Thompson, the Parliamentary correspondent.
The Queen received the Right Honourable Sir Anthony Eden, MP, in audience this morning, and offered him the post of Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury. Sir Anthony Eden accepted Her Majesty's offer and kissed hands upon his appointment. Well, that's the end of the announcement from Buckingham Palace.
Well, that certainly brings back memories to me. Of course, the correspondents, of whom I was one, were confronted by a very peculiar challenge by BBC Television News, because we were brought into vision without the aid of teleprompters.
He complained that the employers always insisted that negotiation and agreement with the unions in the Printing and Kindred Trades Federation must come first.
In 9 councils, there's no change of control, but in Carmarthenshire and Staffordshire, Labour have lost their overall majority. Now, here are the details.
This lack of a teleprompter had unfortunate consequences in the press. The readers were soon dubbed as the guilty men, because the constant looking down at the script, with an occasional glance at the camera, gave them a furtive appearance.
In the final of the RAF Soccer Cup competition, played at Uxbridge this afternoon, Kinloss beat Horsham St Faith by 5 goals to 2.
At the end of that time, new situations began to develop. The prompters arrived
on the scene, for one thing. I dare say in very rudimentary form, as the modern technologists would think of it. But curiously enough, I didn't take to them at all. But of course they were the instrument of the future. And the other big challenge that arrived, an even bigger challenge than that, was of course the arrival on the scene of the competitor, ITN.
Welcome to Channel 9. We
Dubbing
open
data
our
ready. Stand by, Graham.
So over first of all now to the ITN studio, and your newscaster tonight is Christopher Chataway.
Q Grams. Cameron 1. Stand by to Q Chris. Coming to 2. Q Chris.
Good evening.
For the BBC, the arrival of ITN on September the 22nd, 1955, was something of a cultural shock. For a start, it tried to be a programme, not an illustrated radio news bulletin, and it horrified critics at Broadcasting House by doing precisely what BBC News had so studiously avoided. It personalised the newsreader, or newscaster, as Robin Day and Christopher Chataway were called. Robin Day, in particular, had a lack of deference in his interviewing technique that was quite outside the BBC's approach to this kind of thing.
In his garden, in his house in Cairo, here is President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt.
This is a British packet of ball bearings, and this is an almost identical packet of ball bearings made in Japan, a deliberate copy. What do you have to say about that?
I think this is out of order. What does the Foreign Minister have to say about it? That was my question to the Foreign Minister.
Yes, Foreign Minister will need time to answer this kind of question. If you have this in mind, you should have given him advance knowledge.
He didn't ask for advance knowledge of any questions whatever.
Of course we don't, because we didn't expect you were so treacherous.
You think this is treachery to show you these packets?
Yes, this courtesy.
The man who did more than anyone to shape ITN in its early days was the editor for 12 years, Sir Geoffrey Cox.
I came into television from Fleet Street, and it seemed to me the natural thing to do was to put a journalist in front of the camera and let him talk directly to the viewers.
You didn't feel that this would in some way impugn the impartiality of news, the objectivity of it?
Well, there was always a risk of that, and we had to hammer out in the early days what were the proper limits between analysing the news and expressing opinions on it. And we had some ding-dong battles behind the scenes as to where that boundary line should be drawn.
What advantage did the idea of having a newscaster give you over the BBC News at the time?
In presentation terms, it gave us the advantage of personality. Television is a personality medium, and we were able to have the news reinforced by the personality of the newscaster.
At Alexandra Palace, the impact of Sir Geoffrey's ideas and approach to television news sent shockwaves through all its corners and corridors, and it led to changes. In effect, what had been happening at AP was an attempt, often an ingenious attempt, to try to illustrate what were basically sound news bulletins, rather than taking the medium of television first and trying to find ways of using that to present the news. A step in that direction, though, came when professional newsreaders were allowed in front of the cameras for the first time. People chosen for their ability to put words across to the public on the small screen.
In the Commons, Mr. MacLeod has said that the London busman's pay claim is to go to the industrial court without delay.
Kenneth Kendall and I shared the late-night summary, and then Robert Dougal read the first full-length bulletin.
This produced a quite formidable competition, because when the BBC decided to play the personality card, they had some formidable personalities to put into the field. And if you look at the team they were able to field then, with Bob Dougal, Richard Baker, Kenneth Kendall, and Michael Aspel, these were very able and very personable figures, and we had to fight very hard against them.
So, by the middle of the 50s, largely in response to the arrival of ITN, the BBC was beginning to get its television news operation together, helped in 1956 by two stories that put it firmly on the map. The British paratroop drop into Egypt, part of the plan to recapture the Suez Canal, divided the nation. The government of the day regarded the events as a declaration of war and insisted that the BBC should therefore give it total support. But the BBC, despite threats of a government takeover, allowed the opposition the right of reply. This, more than anything else at the time, reinforced the BBC's political independence. And the other big story of the time, the Hungarian revolt and Russian measures to contain it, finally established television news as compulsive and necessary viewing. Night after night, pictures from Budapest had millions glued to their sets. From both the Hungary and Suez coverages, people could see for themselves, not long after it happened, the results of political decisions made on their behalf. It gave television news a much increased significance and importance as a mass communication outlet. The only thing holding it back now was the lack of technology. But towards the end of the 50s, even that began to change. The new 16mm lightweight camera with magnetic soundtrack gave much greater flexibility to the kind of coverage crews could get. The role of the television reporter was developing, someone who went out with a camera crew to note what was filmed, shape it, and write words to go with it. Outside broadcasts and the BBC's regional networks were also beginning to contribute. By the late 1950s, it wasn't just technological advance which was affecting the way television news was developing. There were some pretty earth-shattering editorial changes too. The key figure now was Hugh Green, who took over from Sir Ian Jacob as Director General in 1960. And his avowed aim was to drag the BBC kicking and screaming into the 60s. He commissioned a report on television news from people experienced in television, and they produced a pretty devastating critique. The main drift was that television news should be freed from the shackles of radio news at Broadcasting House. It should have its own reporters, its own writers, its own newsroom, and be quite separate from the radio news organization. Hugh Green's initiative, carried out by the two editors he appointed between 1958 and 1962, Stuart Hood and Michael Peacock, set television news on a quite different course.
5 seconds to go.
That new course was strengthened now by several more big technical breakthroughs.
We in television are convinced that the ability to portray immediacy, to realize what's new, what's going on, is the true significance of this new communications bridge.
Satellites provided the kind of facility that enabled not just millions, but hundreds of millions of people to share in the emotion of a single event, demonstrated most vividly at the funeral of President Kennedy in Washington in 1963. By now, the bulletins had come a long way from the original concept of a simple, illustrated summary of the news. They brought a dimension to world news that radio could never match.
The bombing pause in the Vietnam War is over. In a broadcast last night, President Johnson said that all American peace moves had been rebuffed and that he had ordered the resumption of air attacks on supply lines in North Vietnam. Our correspondent Anthony Lawrence reports from Saigon.
Targets were along the east coast. Naval pilots reported knocking out a bridge and damaging the approaches to a ferry landing not far from the town of Dong Hoi.
The Vietnam War was the big story now, and with the increasing sophistication of coverage, particularly foreign news coverage, the talk now was about how to make most use of the great increase in the amount of footage coming in from all over the world. More time, longer news programs was now a growing demand. ITN had been arguing the case for some time. But the BBC was first on the air with a full half-hour news program.
Good evening. And tonight, in France, 0 hour is 8 o'clock.
It was on Channel 2 at 7:30, and within a few weeks, in colour. The year was 1968, a year that was soon to justify the demands for the longer news format with a series of big stories.
Into the early hours of this morning.
It started as a protest against the government's ban on the return to France of the student leader Cohn-Bendit. But with the first tear gas bombs from the riot police, the stage was set for a battle with all the violence of the first Paris student rebellion 2 weeks ago.
At home in 1968, the big running story of the year was also a series of huge demonstrations, in this case against the war in Vietnam. The way television news covered the demonstrations, even the fact that it covered them at all, led some to protest that it was only encouraging more of the same. It was the first sign that the messenger was being blamed for spreading the message, but the full force of that criticism was reserved for the next decade. The Grosvenor Square demonstrations were the last big stories covered by television news from Alexandra Palace. The old place had seen tremendous changes in the way the public were kept in touch with what was going on in the world. For 15 years, the men and women who'd worked at the palace had been preoccupied with getting a television news formula that would inform and attract the viewers. They'd been absorbed in the technicalities of the medium. It had all been great fun. And when Robert Dougal and I sang our farewells at the close-down party in September 1969, it was with genuine affection for the place and the people we'd worked with. The end of an era.
Now is the time to say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Now is the time to yield a sigh.
Yield it. Yield it.
Now the old news is going gay and joining showbiz down White City way. Goodbye, goodbye, we're leaving you, skiddly-da, goodbye. We wish a fond goodbye, fa-ta-ta-ta, goodbye.
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 Goodbye, Addy-Paddy. Why not say it again?
Yes, why not indeed?
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Joel Compass here in Television Centre. Can I have a word, please, with Richard Whitmore or George James?
Hello, this is BBC Television News. My name is Davidson. Could I speak to somebody, please, concerning a request for an interview with the Chancellor?
The move to Television Centre at the end of 1969 happened to coincide with a subtle change in the role of television news as a whole.
Thank you. Can you ask Larry Harris to give me some copy on Jackson for 145, please?
Okay, what's the next story you don't want me to do?
The newfangled toy, as television was once described by Sir William Haley, was now the nation's main source of information. And that brought with it, for the people who worked in the business, a whole new set of problems, of which by far the biggest was the situation in Northern Ireland.
I would have thought there might have been some point in having him explain this.
It looked and sounded very much like the end of the ceasefire. The army are up here in the middle of Leonardoon Avenue. They'd come together after an earlier confrontation down the end, which looked at the time like the kind of civil rights clash we knew from years ago.
The BBC faced the difficulty of how to keep the electorate informed about what was going on there, at the same time making sure that the coverage didn't make the situation worse. After all, pictures of what was happening on the streets of Belfast could be seen there at exactly the same time as they could be seen on sets on the mainland.
Him off there with your sniper rifle. If you see him, only if you see the man with the weapon there.
Let's pull.
It was a difficult, delicate, and often dangerous path, particularly for the camera teams and reporters on the streets. As the BBC's Assistant Director General, Alan Prothero, describes, the responsibilities of it all weighed heavily on people who had to make the final decisions.
In terms of the 9 o'clock news, for example, it would have been possible for us to have broadcast a story at 9 o'clock and for somebody to have been killed as a result of that story at 9:15. Now, that did not for one moment give us any idea of self-censorship or accepting anybody else's censorship, but it did raise the consciousness of all the journalists in television news and indeed throughout the BBC that we had to be absolutely accurate, we had to be quite clear, and we had to put things in context. We learned a lot of lessons, all broadcasters, and I think a lot of newspaper journalists learned a great deal, a large number of lessons during the opening years of Northern Ireland. We learned very quickly to distinguish when we were being used for propaganda purposes, and we learned to analyze very clearly what the intentions were. That was a lesson that was learned very quickly indeed, and was a direct result, I suspect, of the journalist's essential stock in trade. And that has to be cynicism. It has to be a questioning, it has to be an analysis of why people are saying the things they say, as well as what they're saying.
The prospect of a national...
And that questioning of why people say what they're saying now began to be put by academics about the television journalists.
Right then, did it seem to you to be right that the miners were first in an exciting and interesting menu? I think you'd agree for that night. And what did it concentrate on?
I think it was right because it's been going for about 6 weeks.
University departments started to run courses in television news coverage. Students analysed it, developed theories, argued about it. Here at Stirling University, the research professor, doing a 2-year study into news judgments and editorial decision-making, is the former editor of The Guardian and controller of BBC Scotland, Alistair Hetherington. What, we asked him, were people so worried about?
A lot of television journalists, I think, and it's true also of print journalists, were unaware of the degree to which their own background, their own upbringing, their own social values were governing the way they approached a story. Also, they were quite often rather superficial in the way they dealt with it. So there was legitimate criticism on those grounds in the 70s. I think the academic criticism actually has helped to improve the performance. The people who are reporting and who are program editors, who are editing, are more aware now than they used to be of the extent to which their own preconceptions and their own bias may affect the way they present the news.
Scotland Yard
and there were changes to presentation in front of the cameras too.
About a car connected with an alleged bomb plot. They believe the car, a beige Fiat 124 saloon, registration number...
Angela Rippon had joined Bob Dougal, Kenneth Kendall and the rest of us, and she quickly became a national figure.
Urged not to go near or touch the car, but to call the police immediately if they spot it. Tonight's appeal comes as a young couple were charged with conspiring to cause explosions following a police raid on a Bayswater flat earlier this week.
A report on the economy has just come through from number 11 Downing Street. The Chancellor's statement reads as follows. There may be trouble ahead, but while there's moonlight and music and love and romance...
Let's face the music and dance!
Angela's appearance on the Morecambe and Wise Christmas show caused some controversy. It gave television news as a whole immense publicity. But there were those who began to question whether this kind of thing wasn't undermining the credibility of newsreaders, and therefore of news itself.
Okay, stand by in the studio and stand by...
Concern that newsreaders were becoming show business stars was one reason at least for the change in the pattern of presenting the news that came about towards the end of the 70s.
3,
stand by on the scanner.
2, 1...
Go on.
From now on, journalists were to be introduced as readers of the main bulletin.
Okay, sound, cut cue John.
Men and women who had first-hand experience of television reporting on the road. These were people who were used to handling the next big technological development of the time, the introduction of electronic news gathering, ENG. The point about ENG, with its electronic cameras and portable editing equipment which can feed to landlines and satellites, is that it can provide pictures from almost any part of the world instantly. No processing, no dependence on airline schedules, just plug into the nearest feed point and the pictures can go. What it's done is to make world events much more accessible and also available to a growing number of broadcasting organizations. And it's a trend that's begun to worry government authorities. In the Falklands campaign, this immediacy of coverage, or the possibilities of it, caused the Ministry of Defence a whole set of public relations problems. They dealt with it by simply not making facilities available. It meant that reporting from the Falklands was remarkable for the lack of the kind of action pictures we're used to seeing on film from the 2 world wars and from Vietnam. This kind of control is a development that obviously worries the broadcasters.
I think one of our greatest problems in the future is going to be changing an attitude which I see developing, where authority, whether it is central government, local government, the police, whoever, the civil service, are making some very dangerous assumptions that at a time of crisis or at a time of difficulty, they have the power to tell the broadcaster what to publish, what to broadcast, and what not to publish, what not to broadcast. That, I think, is the most dangerous thing that I can see in the future. I hope desperately that this is only a transitory thing, that the underriding concern in this country is actually to reveal, to disclose, to discuss openly. But I am occasionally quite horrified at what are overt attempts to manage the news. And that's what we have to stand out against at all costs.
Perhaps the greatest example of media management in recent times was the operation surrounding the celebrations in Normandy to mark the D-Day landings. All the main Western news organizations used the latest technology to beam pictures of their respective leaders back to their countries. The French had made available, as a temporary headquarters, an empty school. Equipment was brought in by the ton, and to the irritation of the French in particular, some rearrangements had to be made so that several appealing events could be shown live on the breakfast shows in the States. There's another form of control in the way correspondents, 300 of them in the White House press corps alone, are shipped around from facility to facility. Miss the coach, the plane, the meal laid on by the organizers, and you've missed the speech handout and the story.
I didn't realize you're putting the entire package over, so I must listen to the ins and outs and all that.
The BBC's Washington correspondent Clive Small was with the White House party, into Normandy and out again in less than 12 hours. One of his pieces reflected the current frustration with this kind of news manipulation.
His words were those of a statesman, skillfully attuned to the moment of commemoration, but also carrying a political message for the television screens back home. Ronald Reagan as world leader, bestriding the news bulletins and overshadowing his Democratic Party rivals and their contest in the primaries.
Some 3,000 media representatives were on hand to record the D-Day anniversary events. Among them was a correspondent whose picture we saw on the Normandy beaches 40 years ago, Frank Gillard. Back at his old haunts at Arromanches, he was reminiscing about the D-Day events, and he also had some thoughts about the change he'd seen in the tools of our trade and the effects that might have on the next 30 years of BBC television news.
We now have a gigantic new power in our lives which conveys tremendous influence. That influence can be for good or it can be for ill. And governments and other bodies with ideological intentions naturally will seek to control it in order to control the minds of all those who view television or listen to radio. Indeed, it's a fact that in, I believe, more than half the countries of this world, the broadcasting services, television and radio, are actually controlled by the government and are virtually the voice of the government. And what we have to fight for in the years to come is to preserve the integrity of our broadcasting systems and their independence so that they can convey the truth to people and let people make up their own minds on all the issues of the day which have a great bearing on their lives and how the world is going to proceed.
Right, the line tonight. Should we write D-Day stroke Trudeau there as a separate VT? That's nice.
Can you do that with the photographs? Yeah. And then there's a little white there.
Lovely. If you're happy that the camera can move on that.
Whether you use a crackly disc or whether, because it's news, you prefer to use today's sound of Vera from Normandy live this morning.
And we could then cut to these images. I think we should hear from our man there. I think we should hear from Mark Tully. So we'll go a map in the intro. We're getting some Viz News pictures this afternoon. Gary Hewitt, CBC report. And we just hope it all comes together. There's a feed of 2 hours this evening.